Thank you. Good morning. My name is Peter Mayers, presenter of The National Interest on ABC Radio National. Welcome to this Melbourne Writers' Festival session with James Boyce, discussing his latest work of history, 1835, the founding of Melbourne and the conquest of Australia. I chair a lot of public events here at Federation Square, and I always begin with an acknowledgement that we meet on the land of the Kulin nation, traditional owners of this place we now call Melbourne. Having read 1835, that acknowledgement has taken on a deeper, sharper meaning for me. And I see the grasslands where Melbourne now stands, where the city is, as a place where the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people might have met for trade or ceremony with other members of the three language groups that made up the Kulin, or make up the Kulin Alliance, the Wathaurong, Taungurung and Djadjawurrung people. But let's start further south, across Bass Strait in Van Diemen's Land, the subject and title, of course, of James Boyce's first award-winning work of history, Van Diemen's Land. Because Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land is the motherland as far as Victoria is concerned.
Yes, 1835 is a pivotal year in Tasmanian history, and to set the context, I mean, we're familiar with, when we're talking about the settlement of Sydney in 1788, obviously you have to understand developments in Britain to understand why Sydney was colonised in 1788. Similar with Melbourne, we need to understand developments in Van Diemen's Land in the mid-1830s if we're going to understand why this illegal colonisation of the area around the Yarra, the area where we're sitting now, occurred. And what was happening at that time was Tasmania was first settled in 1803. So we'd already had over 3 decades of settlement by that time. And unlike New South Wales, there were no limits of location, there were no boundaries of settlement. So settlers had been allowed to go where they pleased. And during the 1820s, when the free settlers had started arriving, they had very rapidly claimed all the rich grasslands of Tasmania for sheep, which stretched, for those of you who know Tasmania, it was the Midlands area, the area between Hobart and Launceston. When you drive down that main road, that was some of Australia's best sheep country, well-watered, grassy woodlands. But by 1835, it had all gone. And Tasmania had experienced in the early 1830s the first Anglo boom outside of North America. It had been the place to be. In 1830, it had 1/3 of the European population of Australia. It had a higher GDP per capita. It had more wool exports in 1830. It was a
more
boom
wool
place.
than New South Wales. Yep.
Wool exports in 1830. By mid-1830s, that's starting to change again because of the limits on land. But basically, the place is awash with capital. It's awash with settlers wanting more land, free settlers who already had land wanting more land, and new settlers arriving who wanted land and there's no land to be had. And everybody in Tasmania, unlike in Sydney, people knew about the grasslands of Port Phillip. This was no secret.
And that's because Bass Strait wasn't seen so much as a barrier as it was seen as a route.
It's a highway. We have to get our head into the times of sail. The sea is the highway. So the land, it can be the barrier. Sydney and Melbourne are a long way away, and people don't. There's no established overland route. Very isolated from each other. But Launceston to Melbourne is a well-established highway already. There's Europeans already in residence on the south coast of mainland Australia.
And these would be whalers, sealers, and wattlebark collectors.
Yes, all sorts of men, mainly men, though often with Aboriginal women, who are trading sort of material prosperity for freedom, really, mostly former convicts. We often call them sealers, lump them in with sealers, but it's a bit misleading because when we think of sealers, we think of people who make their living only off hunting seals. And in fact, they're sort of vagabond Europeans of all descriptions, but they are hunting seals. They're also bay whaling stations. They're also collecting, as you say, Peter, wattlebark for tanning leather. And ships are regularly plying the coast, picking up the goods, skins, animal skins, swan feathers, and supplying them with a bit of money, a bit of alcohol, a bit of food. Some of them even have small crops growing, semi-permanent communities along the southern Australian coast. The headquarters of that trade is Van Diemen's Land, particularly Launceston, more so than Sydney.
So we have boats going back and forth. We have some settlement of the south coast, what is now Victoria, and so there's an awareness amongst those people in Van Diemen's Land. There's lots more land to be had,
Yep.
but it takes one person or a group of people to actually do that and enter the character of John Batman. Yep. Who was John Batman?
Yes, well, the problem that these settlers had who wanted to colonise Port Phillip was that British government policy and law was quite clear that this would be trespass. There was no ambiguity, no doubt, and even though Lieutenant Governor Arthur in 1835, who's one of the most sort of capable political figures and administrators in Australian colonial history, he'd totally reformed the penal system in Van Diemen's Land. He'd been Lieutenant Governor of the colony since 1824. He was pushing London for the colonisation. He supported the colonisation of Port Phillip, and he was arguing it was also necessary if the penal system was to continue, because remember in those days most convicts were placed on assignment. They weren't like locked up in Port Arthur, or that was a place of secondary punishment. Convicts were meant to work. They were an unfree labour force. But with land running out, what was he going to do with the convicts?
They couldn't expand the labour force anymore.
Yeah, so he needed new demand for the labour. So everything was coming together. Arthur was pushing it, but London was clear. London was in no doubt that settlement was to be restricted to defined limits of location. And they only extended a bit over 100 miles around in an arc around Sydney. And if any settlers who moved on to the grasslands outside of that area were trespassers on what the British government considered to deem to be Crown land. That's why they were called squatters. They were literally squatters, a name that was sort of now has got some respectability, but at the time they were called squatters because they were squatters. So we had this conundrum that people are pushing to move out of Van Diemen's Land, and there's lots of proposals going to London, there's proposals going to Sydney, because of course this area was formerly under the authority of the New South Wales government, not the Van Diemen's Land government. But the cashed up free settlers are reluctant to move because it is against the law.
And they would be taking a legal risk and risking their capital, risking their sheep.
Yeah, it was capital intensive to move men and sheep across the strait. It wasn't like these vagabond sealers who were just sort of doing their own thing and not risking capital. These were men of respectability whose ties with government were very important to them, and they were hesitant to go against the clear legal position. And what you needed someone prepared to take the risk. And when I started writing the book, I was a bit, I was expecting really, to be honest, to downplay the role of John Batman, because of the fact that, it's sort of, often these figures get larger than life in history, and, myths take over. And I thought, it's probably, my instinct was, he won't figure this prominently in my book as he normally does.
And he died 4 years later. I mean, he wasn't around for very long.
4 years later, yeah. And I knew him fairly well from, the Black War of Van Diemen's Land, and
where he had been involved in killings and.
He had been involved in killings, and he'd also, though, been involved in conciliation attempts. He's a very complex character. He'd been both central. There'd been, the other thing I should have mentioned before, in 1835 marks the end of the fighting in Van Diemen's Land. Since the mid-1820s, the island had been engulfed in quite a ferocious conflict, and most of the fighting had ceased by 1832, but the roundup of Aborigines, it had become colonial government policy, Arthur's policy, with the aid of a man called George Augustus Robinson, to round up all of the Aborigines of Tasmania and remove them to Flinders Island. That process was virtually complete in 1835. So that's another part of the jigsaw.
Another important bit of context. But Batman sets up this Port Phillip Association. So he's not acting on his own, but he gets together a group of people, and you've got bankers and you've got lawyers, and so it's a considered operation, isn't it? I mean, he's taking a risk, but he's thinking hard about how to do it.
He's thinking. It's a carefully selected group of friends and very well connected to the Van Diemen's Land government. Powerful bankers involved. They've even got the customs officer in Launceston involved, the bloke who has to clear the ships, again illegally, to Melbourne ports.
A useful contact to have on your side then in that case.
Yeah, and people very closely connected with Arthur, the governor, who clearly knew about this operation, even though he couldn't formally sanction it. But all the same, there needed to be, before this could go, there needed to be that first sort of plunge into the unknown. And it was Batman who did that when he famously crossed over in May of 1835 and did what we call the treaty with the Aborigines and wrote in his diary, "This will be the place for a village." Famously wrote that. He took the plunge, and he comes back triumphant. And the fact that he claims to be the largest landowner in the world in the pub in Launceston, and the Port Phillip Association is, as it's almost like as the government doesn't act with each step, more people come on board and it becomes more open. It's not like there's a clearly defined Port Phillip Association existing in May 1835. There's some of them, they're loosely involved. It's like a loose, informal alliance that gradually gets more formal, and people then start to pledge the capital and by over the coming months, as the government doesn't act, the energy builds up.
Well, you mentioned there the treaty, because of course the thing about Batman is he signed or agreed a treaty with representatives of the Kulin nation. Now, how significant was that treaty? How seriously did Batman himself take it?
Well, what's very important to distinguish here is some of you will have seen the written treaty, and if you haven't, I encourage you to go up to the State Library and walk up a few floors, and it's part of that wonderful display of it's just such a precious display they have up there, and spend an hour or two looking. They've got one of the copies of the treaty. I mean, there was one for the Geelong area and one for the Melbourne area, and there's a few copies in existence. But that treaty is often ridiculed because it's pretty obvious that the Aborigines wouldn't have understood the terms of this treaty, and that where their names are signed, and that they wouldn't have understood that they were ceding hundreds of thousands of land. They wouldn't have had a concept of the selling of land, and so the treaty gets ridiculed and dismissed because of this. But what we need to distinguish is the written treaty, which was clearly a document for colonial and imperial government consumption. It was part of a land claim being made within the evangelical discourse at the time.
And part of the justification for squatting on the Crown lands. Yeah,
and treaties were a normal part of British imperial expansion, and there was a sort of language around it. And when probably later we'll get to discuss the power of the evangelicals in London at the time.
Indeed.
And the treaty was being written for... was a document prepared for their consumption. That question is separate from whether Batman came to an understanding on the banks of... We think it's the Mary Creek. By tradition, it's the Mary Creek in Northcote. Whether he came to an understanding with the Kulin elders, that is a very separate question. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence. We can never be certain about these things. But I think the probability is that there was some understanding reached. That doesn't mean that it's perfect understanding, but that there was some basis of agreement. And I try and set out in the book the reasons I think that. Yeah.
Well, there's a number of interesting things about the treaty. First of all, its very formality represents a recognition that there were owners of the land. And in fact, at one point, Batman writes to Arthur that he calls the Kulin nation the real owners of the soil. So there is a recognition of title implicit in the treaty in itself, the very fact that you sign one. But also, as you say, there appears to have been, in your reading of it anyway, an understanding with the Kulin nation, and that they also saw potential gains out of this alliance. That there was, they weren't selling their land, but they were agreeing to some kind of shared use of that land.
Exactly, yeah. that you can certainly see on both sides why there would have been a motivation for an agreement to be entered into. For the remember that Batman wasn't trying to get them to sign a treaty for unlimited Europeans to occupy the land. In fact, quite the opposite. He is trying to restrict European settlement to him and his fellow Port Phillip Association members. They want to carve up the land. So what he's trying to get the Kulin to agree to is a limited number of Europeans living on their land with their sheep. And remember, the Batman and the Port Phillip Association members in Van Diemen's Land knew how highly vulnerable individual shepherds and sheep were in Aboriginal land from the Tasmanian experience. This was not going to be an official government party with troops, and so this was going to be small groups of Europeans moving into prized Aboriginal hunting grounds with highly valuable sheep. That was going to be very vulnerable to Aboriginal attack if no understanding had been reached. So there's a clear incentive for Batman to reach some sort of understanding. And for the Kulin, they're dealing at this time, the sealers and the whalers we talked about before, the numbers were increasing in the early 1830s. The number of incursions, the number of atrocities was definitely increasing, and especially related to the abduction of Aboriginal women. Aboriginal women were central to this whole sort of vagabond European economic endeavour along the southern Australian coast. And as the numbers of, there was often violence associated with the abduction of women. And so the Kulin were having to deal with increasing incursions of Europeans anyway. And Batman was promising them protection. I mean, this is clear from quite a bit of evidence that he was offering them British goods, and they, again, through the trade with the sealers over quite a few years now, they recognised the utility and value of a number of European goods.
Axes, blankets, other tools, that sort of thing.
Yep. And secure food supplies.
Yep, flour.
And they also appreciated the potential for protection.
So they could foresee. I mean, we're imagining here, or trying to understand the situation at the time, but they could potentially see this is a way of regulating this incursion and having some say over what happens on our land.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're not like the Aborigines that the British met with in 1788. These are Aboriginal people that have already had decades of contact with European people. They're not novices. I mean, even if we just, most of you would have heard of William Buckley, Having a European living with them for 32 years in itself is another factor. But
I'm assuming everyone does know who William Buckley was, the escaped convict who lived with the Aboriginal people around Portland.
He didn't live around the Melbourne area, but he lived around the Geelong, Portland area, and he'd been in residence for 32 years. But sealers had been here for as long. Visiting whalers, not just the bay whalers, the whalers had been coming since the late 18th century. We had had a number of failed settlement parties, the 1803 one that we've just mentioned that moved on to Tasmania after it failed at Sorrento. There was also one in 1826 at Western Port that lasted a couple of years. These are not Aboriginal people who've had no exposure to the British.
Okay, I want to turn to the situation in London and what's going on in London at this time. But just one more quick thing that I really want to mention is that Batman or Batman's associates brought with them a group of Aborigines from New South Wales, originally from New South Wales, to help them deal with the Kulin. Led, or the most senior of them, a man known today anyway as John Pidgeon. Tell us a little bit about that group.
Yeah. Well, another reason where the probability of that some sort of agreement was reached in 1835 is if you look at the makeup of Batman's negotiating party. Batman didn't come over on his own to work out this deal, and we know now that the Kulin representatives were senior elders from different clans, and Batman also had a very experienced conciliation team. And they've been largely written out of history because they're former convicts and Aboriginal people themselves. But Batman, during his conciliation attempts and also involved in the fighting in Van Diemen's Land, had brought over Aborigines from New South Wales that he knew from his Parramatta days. He grew up in Parramatta. and he'd employed them. They'd basically been in his employment for a number of years already, and he'd used them in trying to reach an agreements with Aboriginal people in Tasmania and also in the fighting. So they're experienced operators in the cross-cultural encounter, these men. And similarly with his convict servants he brought over as well. So they'd also had that similar experience. So they're a team that comes here already used to doing this sort of agreement. And in fact, this was exactly the sort of agreement they'd been the Van Diemen's Land government at the end had been trying to negotiate in Van Diemen's Land before it all degenerated into this forced removal. Where you'd have Aborigines continuing to access their land, forms of coexistence. So that's the Aboriginal people who come here. The Sydney Aborigines are absolutely central to the cross-cultural encounter and to the agreement that might have been reached.
Let's switch our gaze now to the other side of the world and what's going on in London in 1835, because it's important to remember that slavery was abolished in 1833, 2 years earlier, finally. William Wilberforce finally, achieves that objective. And we have the rise of what are called the evangelicals. So what's the context in which, in London, the colonial policy, if you like, that surrounds these events in Melbourne?
Yeah, this is an extraordinary time in British politics as well, with the decision in 1830, the British Parliament's vote in 1833 to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire is still quite rightly and justly remembered as one of the most momentous acts in world history. Slavery, an institution that had been part of human existence for millennia, is abolished in the British Empire against. People have looked at this and reshaped it, but in the end, the truth is still there. This was an amazing victory against very powerful economic interests that were tied up with slavery. And this was won largely by a group that we call the evangelicals, who'd been campaigning on it for many decades. It's a bit of a confusing term, and I don't really like it, but there doesn't seem to be any alternative. It's so entrenched in historical discourse.
Well, it has a very different meaning today, doesn't it? Evangelical.
Yep. The problem is that we think of them as evangelical, like we use evangelical Christian today, and which I would suggest is more in an alternative American fundamentalist tradition than the British evangelical tradition. And some of their theologies could be quite varied, actually, when you look at the individuals involved. And they're not a particularly large group when it comes to the political campaigning element of it. It's not like a mass campaign in that sense. It's a small group of fairly well-connected men and women, very much women at the centre of this. And the victories won in 1833, and then Wilberforce has passed on the mantle then to a leadership of the parliamentary forces to a man called Thomas Buxton, and this group turned their attention to the condition of native peoples throughout the empire, and the height of this, there's a couple of the height of their concern is to set up a select committee of the House of Commons. It's a very famous inquiry. It looks at the condition of native peoples throughout British settled areas, and it's sitting at the very time that Melbourne is founded, and so it's really Melbourne is founded at the time in the 19th century when the British government was more focused on the condition of native peoples really than at any time before or since. It's a sort of an extraordinary fact, given the decisions that were made, and it makes unpacking the whole thing all the more complex and interesting, and in many ways sad. But so that's the context in London, and particularly we've had the Reform Bill, and some of you would have heard the Reform Bill, with the sort of important stage towards development of democracy in Britain. It's still not a universal franchise by any means, but the franchise has been extended and some of the worst abuse has gone. And it's a very tumultuous time. It's not like mid-Victorian England. Nothing has settled down yet. There's been lots of protests, there's lots of unrest, there's lots of fear of the poor, there's lots of fear of industrialisation. There's still entrenched poverty. We haven't gone through to, a clear sense of rising living standards yet. And there's a lot of political turmoil, a lot of changes in government in a short period. And in May 1835, though, so just almost exactly the same time as Batman's here doing his deal with on the banks of the Mary Creek, a new government comes to power led by Lord Melbourne, where the evangelicals are in the ascendancy. It's a Whig government, and we have the Secretary of State for the colonies, so the person who's in charge of the colonies is an evangelical.
It's Lord Glenelg.
Yeah. Glenelg, yes, he's promoted to the House of Lords and becomes Lord Glenelg. And there's a man called James Stephens just after this, who's a long-term bureaucrat, very powerful evangelical long-term bureaucrat in the Colonial Office, is soon made the boss of the Colonial Office, and he's one of the most influential public servants in colonial policy in the 19th century. So the evangelicals are in the ascendancy just as Melbourne's being founded.
It's an extraordinary time, as you say, and we have this House of Commons Select Committee on Aborigines, not just in Australia, but colonial settlements around the world, and it reports in 1837, and it recognises that Indigenous inhabitants have, and this is a quote, an incontrovertible right to their own soil, a plain and sacred right. So it's an extraordinary finding if we think about it. Now, what's interesting is that in 1836, Governor Arthur in Van Diemen's Land writes to Lord Glenelg, Secretary of State for the colonies, in 1835, Governor Arthur writes to Lord Glenelg and tells him what's going on with this Port Phillip Association. In January 1836, so less than a year after the treaty with the Kulin, Lord Glenelg, Secretary of State for the colonies, writes back opposing the expansion of a settlement to Port Phillip, saying this is not policy, this should be stopped. 2 months later, the same man, Lord Glenelg, writes another letter, this time to Governor Burke in Sydney, who of course is actually the one with administrative responsibility for Port Phillip, and changes policy and says, yes, go ahead. Why do we get this sudden change within a couple of months in London by Lord Glenelg to, on the first hand, say it's not policy, on the other hand, to essentially sanction it?
Yeah, well, in some ways, this book could have equally been called 1836. Because
well, I thought it could have been called a lot of things. Actually, I had a few other names. One would have been an act of trespass. Another would have been a plain and sacred right. But anyway.
Yeah. Because the decision, this momentous decision made in 1836 to reverse what is then near 50-year policy of the British government of concentrated settlement. We take it for granted now that because the British always made this legal land claim over the whole continent, they deemed it all, to be Crown land. We take it for granted that meant that white people could always go where they pleased. In fact, until this, they could not until 1836. And this dramatic policy reversal in 1836, which abolished all boundaries, borders and limits effectively in relation to Australian land settlement, it should be studied a whole lot more. It should be part of our national story. And the reasons for the British government policy reversal, I think in my book, I hope it's only chapter 1 of us really revisiting this and really looking at how land settlement policy was so dramatically reversed, because it's had such massive impacts on Australian history ever since. And I've only come, I think, in some ways to sort of tentative and provisional conclusions. But what we can say is that Governor Arthur, and once he found out about it, Governor Burke in Sydney as well, clearly bought time. And this was a familiar strategy. The fact it could take 12 months, you could write to London seeking clarification of something, even if you already knew the answer, and it's likely to be 12 months to come back. And these both Burke and Arthur are capable administrators.
So you've got 12 months to go and do what you're doing while you wait for instructions to the contrary.
And, it's a strategy of illegal colonisation all over the world and always has been, is to wait for facts on the ground to move to a certain point. It's very hard to reverse something that's already happened. So, you can squash it at the beginning, but once something's gone to a certain step, it's very difficult to reverse something. So that's part of the dynamic that's happening, because we just celebrated, Melbourne celebration might be the wrong word for this, but we've just commemorated what's now called Melbourne Day on 30th of August, which is the day when the camp was first made on the Yarra. And because the colonial authorities didn't intervene and sort of allowed this to go, it built momentum, and more people are coming. Still only from Van Diemen's Land in 1836, but more and more are coming. So what Arthur does, rather than sort of take action and actually do something about this,
uses authority to say no, stop.
No, yeah. What he does is he writes to London seeking clarification. What should be our policy, even though the British government only just before had confirmed the policy of concentrated settlement. He very well knew what their policy was, but he wrote seeking clarification. Burke did the same thing. Arthur's letter arrives in about just early in the new year, and that's what Peter first referred to, and their response to Arthur is no, to confirm that this is not to go ahead. It restated the policy of concentrated settlement, and that these people were trespassers, and that he was to uphold the law. That was what the reply he got. Now, just a few months later, when Burke's arrives from Sydney, there's a dramatic policy reversal in that few months, and the British government gives the go-ahead to the colonisation of Port Phillip. And in doing so, also, as I said before, make this decision to end the policy of concentrated settlement altogether and to allow settlers, the squatters now to go.
So the new policy applies not just to Port Phillip, it applies to New South Wales as well. And so what we see then is settlers continuing to come from Van Diemen's Land and move out from Port Phillip, but also then moving down in the wheel ruts of Major Mitchell,
yes.
From Sydney.
So it's towards
Port Phillip.
From later 1836.
Yeah. And so we get what, here in Victoria, we're all familiar with the gold rush, but before the gold rush, there was the land rush, or you might call it the sheep rush. And I'm just going to quote a couple of stats from your book, absolutely extraordinary figures. In 1837, there were 1,000 people and 20,000 sheep in Port Phillip. In 1842, there were 20,000, sorry, in 1837 there were 1,000 people and 26,000 sheep. By 1842, there were 20,000 people and 1.4 million sheep. So this is where we see the conquest of the mainland, the conquest of Australia, really.
I mean, Alan Atkinson, the very eminent Australian historian, has pointed out that in 1835, British settlement in Australia really amounted to sort of pinpricks. If we like to see this sort of imperial red. Well, if you see the imperial red on the continent of Australia in 1835, there's really only very small areas of red. It's still Aboriginal Australia. There's small areas have been settled, but if you do the same thing 5 years later, it's the speed with which, once the limits and boundaries and borders were abolished, squatters who could get you got a pastoral licence, a squatting licence. It wasn't over a particular area of territory. It wasn't a sort of licence to sort of, you can put sheep on Federation Square or something. It was or within defined boundaries. It was to put sheep on Crown land. And you could, there was a sort of race over the top of each other to the next bit, following the waterways, of course, following where the water, and it was a race to secure the land, because the great irony is the way that they could prove their land was with the common law right of possession, which was being denied to the Aborigines at the very same time. But so they had to prove that they had put men and sheep on that patch of land and then they had the right to graze it. And so, but there was nothing to stop one squatter, having multiple runs. The term was runs. And so they leapfrogged over each other and the expansion that occurred, Richard Broome, the La Trobe University historian, he's written his History of Victoria, he talks about it as one of the fastest land occupations in the history of empires. It's a phenomenal expansion. Within a decade, the squatters are stretching from Wilson's Promontory to Harvey Bay. Most of the most heavily populated parts of Australia, which in Aboriginal Australia, as in European Australia, was in the southeast coast, is occupied.
So what happens?
So we have this vast expansion very, very quickly, and it's faster than what we were all very familiar with. The North American story. This is a much faster land occupation than anything that's occurred in the United States.
And what happens to the Kulin Nation and the other Aboriginal groups in this time?
Well, what I try and argue in the book is that there's a lot of debate about what happens and why. There's a lot of, and in particular in that sort of sordid and sad chapter of our national life that was called the History Wars, which did very little, unfortunately, to progress understanding, but in the end was a debate that had to be had because it was, there was people with a very clear political agenda out to promote that agenda through history. But what I'm trying to point out in this book is the critical question is not how many died from violence or how many people died from disease. The point is that most Aboriginal people were dead within 15 years. And the reason that they were dead was because of the speed of the conquest.
So you give plenty of examples of frontier violence, of reprisal killings, massacres, and so on. But the overall point is actually the taking of land and of food sources, means of survival.
Yeah, that there was the whole point. Again, we just assume that coexistence was impossible. We assume it was impossible in law, and we assume it was impossible in reality. I dispute both. But a different way, I mean, I'm not saying there was any happy way or any peaceful way or any way that didn't involve suffering or any sort of utopian way of settlement, but there were other paths that could have been followed, but that had the potential to reduce suffering and allow greater forms of coexistence. But they all require the whole land settlement process to have been properly regulated and properly slowed down. They all required time. It was the fact that it was just this private conquest where people were allowed to go, and the squatters, even though they didn't have land title, they weren't being given a title to the land. They were just being given the right to graze their sheep on the land. That was all they were being given. The only legal right they had, but they assumed an exclusive right to the land. That became the colonial norm. They assumed the right to kick other users off the land, and Aborigines were deemed other users. They were deemed trespassers on their own land.
And again, there's a kind of parallel or an interesting reference back to what's going on in England, isn't there? Because, I mean, the idea of common lands and common usage of lands was quite well established.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was also disappearing around this time, the enclosures and so on. So in a sense, you get this privatisation. It's part of a bigger process of the privatisation of land.
Yes. Because in England, and Ireland as well, and Scotland and Wales, in the British Isles, as in much of Europe for that matter, there's a distinction between ownership of land and rights to use the land. And the common land of Britain, it wasn't that nobody owned it. It was all owned by somebody, but they were established in common law various rights of use of the land. So the right to grazing of the land, the right to collect fuel from it, the right to walk through it, to access it, the right to fish on it, hunt on it. All these things are established common rights, and they'd been quite rapidly being extinguished over the previous couple of hundred years, sometimes requiring acts of legislation. And that process was nearing completion in the 1830s as well. But it was still assumed in Britain. It wasn't the people, the evangelicals and the others didn't have the worldview that we have now, that one owner meant that coexistence was, that one use of the land precluded the other. People assumed that you could have the grazing rights of the land and the Aborigines would continue to have the right to hunt, and as they, the term they used, roam over it. So was actually eventually written into pastoral leases, this right, but too late for the Aborigines of Port Phillip in the late 1840s. It was eventually written in, and that becomes a very important in the more recent Wick judgment. That there's a whole history there that we won't have time to get into today. But unfortunately, these rights were never enforced, even when they were written into the agreements.
I'm going to invite your question shortly, but I've got a couple more myself for James before we get to you. What happens then as food sources disappear, the sheep eat various things that Aborigines would have used, game disappears because the sheep take food sources, all sorts of resources the Aboriginal people of the southeast of Australia would have relied on disappear. They come to Melbourne. Aboriginal people come to Melbourne in quite large numbers, and initially this is promoted by the authorities on the basis that if the Aborigines come in, they will learn about labour and working for a wage. So Melbourne becomes quite a hub for Aboriginal people around this time, during this sheep rush in the late 1830s, early 1840s.
Yeah, we often talk about Aboriginal people coming into British settlements in Australian history, because they do. They come in out of curiosity. They come in out of for British goods and supplies, and you see that. You still see it in Northern Australia today. Aboriginal people come into to white settlements for all sorts of reasons, But in the case of, and this had happened in Sydney, and it's happened pretty much everywhere. The case of the first settlement of Melbourne in 1835, though, it's even more. It's beyond that. It's a case of a few Europeans, I think, coming into what remained very much Aboriginal land. So it's really at different times of the year, according to seasonal movements, the Aboriginal people outnumber the whites in that first year, and for various reasons to do with the fact that, ironically, that it was still an illegal settlement and the outbreak of large-scale violence was not going to be seen favourably by the authorities. So there's attempts to preserve some sort of peace in that first year. It's a very unusual period, the first year. Once the settlement's sanctioned by the government and authorities arrive in September 1836, the situation for Aborigines becomes more difficult. But there's still the attempt to set up an Aboriginal mission, an Aboriginal station, and that's with a missionary, and as Peter was alluding to, and I mean getting, not just providing goods, but getting people to work, but this then they then get evicted from there as well. Once Latrobe arrives.
The camp I mentioned on the current side of the Botanic Gardens was a place where it was a kind of refugee camp for Aborigines. And as you say, Latrobe arrives. So we've gone from this policy of having deliberately kind of attempted to engage the Aborigines and civilise, for want of a better term, and create wage labour and so on. Suddenly Latrobe arrives and he wants them out.
He wants them out, yeah. And sometimes I wonder if it's because his house was sort of overlooked this sort of squalid camp. And it only occurred to me last year when I was sort of walking around the different sites, and I thought he could probably just about, it would have really been impacting on his. But he did want them out, but there's this fascinating, well, tragic really. I mean, but because the dispossession accelerates in the late 1830s and 1840s, you have so many refugees, and you have a situation where the Aboriginal population of Melbourne actually increases, because this is, as in the nature of around the world today, you can still see this in different parts of the world, that the cities become in a sort of refuge. They're not going to. Aborigines aren't going to be. There's some chance of getting food, through prostitution, through begging. There's also a lot of wasteland in Melbourne, and this is where, getting right back to what Peter said at the beginning, there's a lot of swampland especially on the south side of the river, and at this point they hadn't got around to draining the swamps. The Yarra wasn't this sort of neat canal it is now from the CBD down to the bay. It was Tim Flannery calls it a temperate kakadu. It was full of lagoons, and it was a rich wetland, and that's just as in Britain, just as in all parts of the world. These wastelands are always refuge for the dispossessed refugees, and there's sort of informal Aboriginal camps in bits of bush around where people are still gathering. It's very hard to for us to really. There's still elements of tradition in this as well. It's very difficult to put your finger on it. But there is this paradox until the populations are completely decimated by disease, really, by the late 1840s, where there are large numbers of Aboriginal people coming in, but they're coming in as from all over the Port Phillip district, as it was called.
Okay, one more question, because it's the big question that I need to ask you before I invite some questions from the audience, and that is, I suppose, running through our conversation this morning and through the book is a question: could it have been otherwise? And there are plenty of people who will say, well, this is the way it happened, but it was going to happen. The interests involved, the capital involved, the profit motive involved, it was going to happen one way or another. What was, this is just what happens. It was inevitable.
Yeah, well, this is surely one of the great questions of, not just Australian history, but for all Australians, is did it have to be this way? And when I originally was researching the book, it was very much going to be about the Van Diemen's Land connection, but this question increasingly just haunted me, really, because I'd read so much where even from historians of all political persuasions, not just from a more conservative background, but including people writing Aboriginal history, people writing environmental history, people extremely concerned about the consequences of the untrammelled resource rush, were still assuming its inevitability, that there was nothing that the governments could have done to control the squatters. And this was the very argument that Governor Burke and Governor Arthur were using to London in 1835 and 1836. It was almost like it was getting repeated as fact. And without it, it had become a deeply grained assumption rather than a considered, argued position. And the fact that there even was a policy choice made in 1836 was rarely mentioned. It was sort of like government just playing catch up with reality, with Australian environmental reality. Sheep needed vast areas, and with the power of the local squatters. How could governments control this? And it was, and in accepting the inevitability of that rapid, uncontrolled land settlement process, we then accept really the inevitability of what happened to the Aboriginal people. Because as I said before, within that land policy, if you allowed that land policy, there was going to be terrible suffering. I mean, it was really, you might be able to do a few things around the edges, but the idea of the Port Phillip protectors were, you just couldn't have a protectorship with that land policy. It had to be slowed down, it had to be regulated. So the question of could it have been different really is around, well, could we have actually regulated this first resource rush? This was the first resource rush, not the gold rushes. The rush that never ended began in the mid-1830s with this rush on the grasslands. So, and the question of could that have been slowed down and regulated, could things have been different? I think it's of enormous historical significance, it's enormous moral significance, it's also of great contemporary political significance, obviously, because we still, I think, tend to assume that governments, even if there's a limit to what governments can do, we assume that market forces will overwhelm political choice, that market forces are ultimately more powerful than the political process. That's an assumption I think that we really need to be debating and looking at. And if you go back to the 1830s, you can see, in fact, it's quite clear that a political choice was made. Batman, the others who moved in, the squatters who moved in, did so as a result with the political support of the colonial authorities. It wasn't like the governments were playing catch-up. The governments, in fact, led the resource rush. They were partners in this. There was a decision was made. That decision caused anguish to people. They were aware of the consequences. But when Arthur and Burke argued that there was nothing they could do to control it, that was an argument in favour of their preferred position.
Yeah. So inaction was action in that sense. Yeah. Look, let's. We have time for just a couple of questions, I think, to wrap up. Does someone want to? We have a question right down the front here. We'll just wait for the microphone and I'll get you to be brief, please.
Just two very brief questions. Firstly, in terms of the white people, you mentioned that they were coming with Aboriginal people from Tasmania and also from Sydney area and north. What proportion of the white people also were coming from England and Britain? And the second question is with regard to disease. You mentioned that disease practically decimated them in 1840, but how much had that disease started to impact before that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, they're both quite big questions, but I'll try and be brief. Yeah, so just starting with the disease, there is a strong argument that there've been two smallpox outbreaks before. I question in the book that the one around 1830 actually reached the Port Phillip district. I think there's some very strong doubts about that one. There'd been the earlier outbreak in the late 18th century probably had. So the Aboriginal population would have been less, but there was signs that it was recovering, and it was at the time in 1835. There's lots of young people, there's lots of pregnant women. It's a vibrant community life around here, and there's elderly people for that matter as well. So I think. Anyway, there's more on that in the book on that debate. It's an important one. The other question of whether there were settlers from Britain, of course, these were Vandemonian Britons. They're originally from Britain, but they're experienced operators in the bush. I mean, my previous book in Van Diemen's Land, I talk about this, the adaptation to the environment that had gone on. They're not bumbling Britons of 1788. They're experienced operators in the Australian bush who are settling here in 1835. So they're Vandemonian Britons, if you like. But the people directly from England start coming within a couple of years, but really from 1838 you start to get ships coming in from Britain. And where the Immigration Museum now stands, which documents that history of immigration, is almost exactly where the first tents were pitched, by the way, which is sort of quite symbolically appropriate, isn't it?
Okay, one more question. We have just another one down the front here.
On the question of whether the process of land settlement was inevitable, could have been stopped, could have been done differently, were there any voices of dissent at the time? Yes,
there were. Certainly the dominant colonial opinion was that they wanted what happened, of course. But there were voices of dissent even within the colony, as well as in England. I quote in the book the Aborigines Protection Society in London arguing in 1837, saying this is not an appointment of heaven. That's their term. This is, by that they mean this is not inevitable. This is something that we're in control of. Don't blame, because I mean people they used to use the language of divine providence as part of the inevitability. This was divine providence. This was inevitable. Then and before we laugh too much of that, I think the language of economics almost has some of the same, the same force. This was inevitable because of the god of money and profit. But no, there were voices of dissent. But it's amazingly how quickly they disappear in the colonial level, and so within a few years, it's like everybody assumes. This is what I make the statement in the preface that, in a sense, this is when Australia is born, because very quickly it becomes taken for granted, and the debate disappears. It just becomes assumed that this is, our continent, and we can live where we like. That becomes so commonsensical that Australia is a sort of white land where even though Aboriginal people might still be the majority in various parts of it, very, very quickly it becomes taken for granted that white people can go where they like and live where they like, and in a sense this is our country. And the debate just drops off the radar. It's quite extraordinary. And unfortunately in Britain too, the evangelicals lose their political influence quite quickly, and debates move on there as well. And there's this sort of moment in time in the mid-1830s is gone. And so even in Britain, the Aborigines Protection Society becoming they sort of start to shift their position in the 1840s as well, and the debate disappears there as well and gets lost in time and forgotten. So the debate doesn't disappear, and the voices of dissent continue, like Henry Reynolds writes, in his Whispering in Our Hearts book. They never disappear, but they become very much on the margins of political and policy debates, which they were not in the mid-1830s. Yeah.
I'm under strict instructions to finish on time, so I'm sorry I'm not going to take any more questions. I'm going to wind up with a little quote from a review of 1835. It's by a little-known reviewer, some bloke called Malcolm Turnbull. And this is what he says in his review, which was published in the Monthly. His lesson, as in James's lesson, his lesson is a sobering one. It's simply this. When governments say doing the right thing is too hard, what they're really saying is that it is more lucrative or expedient to do the wrong thing. Our forebears preached protection of native people and the blessings of Christ, while they largely destroyed a people and a way of life. So I'll leave you with that thought from Malcolm Turnbull, book reviewer. And I would like to remind you that James Boyce is happy to sign copies of books at the Dymocks bookshop down in the foyer in Federation Square. And I will close by saying that I think anyone who calls Melbourne home, indeed anyone who calls Australia home, should read this book. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.